you'll hear a lot about investing and companies and specific industries. None of what is said here should be construed as investment advice or recommendation, so that we can actually put more flavor into our conversation. So I think it would be great to start with some of the definitions, because I think there is a lot of jargon out there in terms of what is ESG, what is impact, the Sustainable Development Goals. So maybe Sophia, if you want to get started on what is actually sustainable investing, what should we think about in terms of the transition?
Great, thank you very much, Arianna, and good evening, everyone. So, I mean, as you've just heard, I work in a company called Clean Energy Transition. So when I saw the title of this panel, I immediately thought of the energy transition. But then I reflected and I thought, well, actually, this is a much broader subject. You know, this is transition to a sustainable future. So I thought of looking at the history, you know, where you know, who started this? You know, how long ago did we hear the idea of a sustainable future? And interestingly, it was actually in 1662, a chap called John Evelyn first mentioned the need to address sustainability for forest management. He basically saw that lots of forests in the UK were being destroyed and not replaced. And so he actually wrote an essay and mentioned the need to care for resources. And over the centuries, a number of other people, you know, did put forward the idea that we cannot use all our natural resources without replacing them or recycling them. But if we move forward to fast forward basically to the 20th century, it seems that it was in 1972 with the Club of Rome that the whole idea was formalized, and a couple, I think they're a couple, I mean, they might be brothers and sisters, I'm not sure. But Dennis and Donella, I assume they were a couple, Meadows, actually formalized the whole idea of needing to have a sustainable world system. So you can go back to what they wrote. But I think the definition I like the most is one from the UN, and who's talking about a sustainable development, and basically in their view, their definition, it's a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I thought that was actually a good definition because it's very, very broad. So I leave it to this, and I think Charlotte might be talking more about the definition of ESG.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, before we sort of dive into things, I thought it would be useful as well to give an explanation of ESG. Many of you attending this evening will, I'm sure, have heard of this term before, and it's environmental, social, and governance. And it's a sort of area that's become very popular within the investment world, where investors are sort of looking at different areas within a company. So how it's impacting the environment, what social issues may it be addressing, or how are they looking at social issues within a company, and then governance. And that sort of term is applied really looking at the management team and how they are governing the company and the board of directors. So a lot of different sort of aspects coming into play there, which investors are increasingly focusing on.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for both for the definitions. And I think from my experience, ESG was actually my summer intern project when I started at Goldman. And I think it's now become priority number 1, 2, and 3 of most CEOs in the world. So I think we've definitely seen a shift around the importance driven by this generation, which I think is phenomenal, but also like the fact that a lot of people are recognizing the business case for it, which is what this panel is about. So maybe Tilly, I'll turn over to you to talk about like what role do investors actually play in this transition, and what can us and everyone in the audience like think from their own perspective, and what are the different approaches to actually investing in a sustainable future.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to answer as best I can. So I think it's really important to consider that the institutional investment landscape is really, really broad. So there's no one answer to that question because, for example, if you're an asset owner like me, so I basically manage the portfolio of permanent capital that belongs to the University of Cambridge, that's sort of one potential model in which I can have some impact on this transition. If you're an asset manager like Sophia, who works in a particular fund and is involved in individual security selection decisions, investing in one company or another, you'll be able to have exercise your influence in a different way. And likewise, within the fund management landscape, there are so many different types of fund managers. So some fund managers obviously invest in public equities, others invest in private equity, which means that they might own the whole company rather than just owning a stake in a company. Others are investing in real estate or in credit, in bonds, and so on. So the types of influence that different kinds of investors, different categories of investors can have is very different. And we can talk about that more specifically as we go on. But I think fundamentally the role of an investor is to be a catalyst, is to exercise your influence through the investment assets that you own or that you manage to bring about some kind of change on the ground. So for example, if you are a private equity fund, and let's say you take a company, you purchase a company from either from a corporation or from the founder, you then actually control the board of the company, and you can actually make changes quite directly. So for example, you might decide to bring in different skills onto the management team. You might decide to incentivize the management team in a different way by introducing environmental targets alongside financial targets and so on. And similarly, within public equities, all public shareholders have a vote. They can bring resolutions to the shareholders. They can vote on resolutions that are brought by other shareholders, and they exercise their influence in that way. So I think it's really exciting that investors are embracing this opportunity to act as catalysts and to use their investment assets for means other than simply generating a financial return.
Yep, definitely. Sophia or Charlotte, if there's anything that you would add.
Yeah, I'm happy to add something. I want to put in perspective why there's a need for investors to do something about it, because so although I mentioned that there's a quite a broad definition in terms of the a sustainable future, a lot of the damage which is done and a lot of the key roots of this need for a transition do lie in energy. Yeah? And it's a fact that we use at the moment in energy about 80% of unsustainable sources of energy versus only 20% which are sustainable. So to get to this sustainable future, we need to inverse this ratio. And to inverse this ratio, we need massive investments. And that's why we need investors. And so, we looked at how much we need to invest, and we came up with a number which was $85 trillion. I'm not talking billions, I'm talking about $1 trillion. The IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, just published in the last 12 months a report saying that we need to invest at least $5 trillion per year to have any chance to have a cleaner energy environment. So, and all this money is not going to come from government. It's going to come from private sources. And that's why we need investors. That's why investors have a huge role in channeling and enabling, basically, this transition. So this is absolutely crucial for the investors to be engaged in this transition. So that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great point. I think just like the sheer volume that is needed to actually address some of these topics, or at least start to tackle some of these topics is really unprecedented, I think. Maybe like, as we talked about, like some of the targets that companies can put within, whether it's their board or like their incentive structures, as well as like the large scale investment that is needed. How do we actually like think about measuring success when it comes to investing in the transition? So thinking about both like the return potential as well as the sustainable impact that you can have. Maybe Charlotte, I'll start with you if you can address that from your standpoint.
Sure. So I think one of the areas in my role that I look at a lot is the social environmental kind of metrics that companies are now looking at and reporting on. And I think it's safe to say over even the past year, the number of companies now reporting on these and including these reports and metrics in at the same time as publishing their annual reports where they're focusing on the financials is astounding. You know, the number that now actually have a sustainability report that never did maybe 1 or 2 years ago. And the detail that some of these companies are going into now is amazing. It sort of, I think, very much depends on the nature of what the company operations are, because obviously there are some companies that will have a lot more to report on. For example, environmental wise, if there's a company that has a lot of energy intensity, then that's important for them to be able to report on that. And the sort of, we have the sort of jargon, but the scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, which is the different levels of emissions that now companies are being increasingly asked to report on by investors and lots of other stakeholders as well, is something that's really kind of coming to the fore, and we're seeing that. And it's important to be monitoring those, and especially to be asking them to set targets is a really important thing, to understand how these companies are actually managing some of these risks. And with the social side as well, metrics and targets as well has been another thing. I've seen a lot of companies focusing on diversity over the past year or two, and actually tying some of these environmental and social metrics, which you mentioned earlier, to management incentives now. So actually management teams have specific ESG targets within their pay, that if they don't achieve these, then they won't get paid X amount. So you really are seeing a huge amount of sort of synergies now with the way that companies are looking at environmental and social issues and how it impacts their operations, and also how the management teams are incentivized.
Great. And maybe from the standpoint of like asset allocators, like Tilly, when you look at an external manager that you guys invest in, how do you measure their success, both from an environmental and social alignment, as well as from the financial performance? And how are those two linked?
Sure. Well, it's really interesting that Charlotte mentioned emissions and diversity as sort of two of the key focus areas, because those are the two things that we try to measure within our portfolio of fund manager partners. So at the endowment, we're not actually choosing individual companies or stocks or bonds to invest in. We're working with fund managers. And it's actually amazing to me that despite the intense focus that exists in the industry on sustainability and ESG related topics, actually the methodologies that exist to measure things like greenhouse gas emissions are still really quite immature. So at the moment, if you're trying to, for example, measure the emissions from a public equity portfolio, there are various databases that you can purchase, but not all companies yet report their emissions. And even when they do, the actual methodology by which they calculate their emissions is not completely comparable. So you're comparing, at the risk of comparing apples with oranges. Nevertheless, we do measure the emissions from our overall public equity portfolio, and we do that for the whole endowment. So we look through all the individual public managers that we work with, and we just aggregate all the holdings, and then we measure that, and we basically compare it to sort of the index, the most closest relevant index. And then what we obviously want to do is see that number decline over time. Now, clearly there are different ways of achieving that, because one way of having the number decline would just be to get out of all the things that have high emissions, but that's not necessarily the approach that we want to take, because clearly that wouldn't necessarily actually end up reducing the emissions in the real economy, as it were. So in order to really reduce the emissions that exist in the world, the high emitting companies actually have to actually reduce their emissions. So what we've been doing actually just over the last few weeks, which has been really fascinating, is we've identified the highest emitting sources within our public equities portfolio. And then we're in individual conversations with those fund managers saying, did you realize that such and such company is a very high emitter? And how can you engage with them? What's your relationship with the management team? How can you put pressure on them? What routes can the company take to accelerate its own transition plan? And I think the real mark of success for us would be if those companies actually reduced their emissions organically, as it were. And it's really, really early days. So not all fund managers do yet report these statistics, some do. And then, of course, when you look at other asset classes like private equity, hedge funds, real estate, and so on, there is no public database available there. So we're going to have to look at other ways to estimate the emissions from those portfolios. And that's what a very intensive piece of work that we're doing this year. But the deeper I get into this measurement point, I'm surprised at the immaturity really of it all relative to sort of measurement of other things like financial metrics or credit statistics and so on.
Yeah, definitely. Sophia, I don't know if there's anything that you would add before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to hear all the different perspectives, because we all have different perspectives, between Charlotte, Tilly, and ourselves. So, we invest, we buy or sell those companies, directly. So we assess, each company on its own merit. I would say two things. First one, I guess I like going back to history. And ESG might be a sort of recent concept. Everybody, it's a trend. It's everybody wants to be part of it. Everybody wants to have it. But again, if you go back to history, and I did that because we had we started our company recently, and we wrote our ESG policy. And again, I wanted to go back to where are the roots, and the roots are over 100 years ago, when the Sainsbury family, for instance, really embraced having companies which were focused on the environment, on the social aspect and the governance side. At the end of the day, very well managed companies had been doing ESG for decades. So we have to be careful, and we are going to touch on greenwashing later. But we like to do. We have two ways of looking at it. The first one is really the holistic way. Is are the companies really embracing these ESG attributes? And it's very easy to find out if they are or not. When you meet with them, if they're engaged or not. You ask a CEO, so what's your ESG policy? So you've got some who are saying, right, fantastic. You're first investor today to ask about this. Let me talk to you about all our initiatives. And then you have the others, turning to their IR, right. Do you mind taking that question, please? It takes 2 minutes to figure out which companies are involved or not. So we do like taking a more holistic approach to see if there is a real engagement. And I can come back to that later. And then there are the requirements that people like Tilly have with us, and saying, how do you measure this? What's your portfolio looking at? I have my own investors. They don't want to be invested in fossil fuels. And so because there was so much demand from our investors, hopefully Tilly saw in our last letter that we did write a report going through all the companies that we hold in our portfolios, looking at 20 metrics. Some of them are obviously, CO2 emissions, others are diversity, but there's 18 other metrics that we selected which we think are relevant, and so we are monitoring this company by company as a total for the portfolio. And then to the point of Tilly made before in terms of discussing with companies which are really making an effort, we think it is really important to back the companies which are very high emitters and who are transitioning to a cleaner future. The highest emitters in Europe are basically power generation companies. They basically use coal or gas to generate power. And so we are seeing a number of companies who actively have decided to reduce their power generation coming from fossil fuels and reinvest into renewables. So, we're very close to those companies and we want to be part of their efforts. And it's not easy. It's not easy at all. So, you asked about returns. How do you measure? And at the end of the day, if I tell Tilly, oh, we've invested in these companies and they're very clean, but they lost, 50% last year, I don't think Tilly will be very happy. So we need to see returns. We need to see companies being re-rated, appreciated, generate earnings, generate growth. So it's all very well to score well on ESG metrics, but if the investments are not generating positive returns, then it's no use to any of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this addresses one of the questions that we got from our audience around, like, how do you look at both? You just consider one side of the risk, or do you look at financial performance in tandem with the environmental or social issues, which I think was dubbed double materiality, which I like. Maybe
well, just on that point, actually, I think there's been a real transition though in investors' mindsets over the last several years, because when I first started thinking about these topics, there was a real sort of dichotomy in the way that constituencies thought about the issues of sustainability, and it seemed to be that there was a choice to be made between, do you want to have a sustainable portfolio, or do you want to generate the best financial returns? And it was almost as if the two were incompatible with one another. And I think that caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of discord between different constituencies. I actually have come to the view, and I think this is a view that's accelerating at the moment, that there isn't necessarily a discord at all between those two objectives, because if you think about it, and as Sophia mentioned right at the beginning, we have to execute this transition to a clean energy future in order for society to kind of have a chance of surviving in its current form. So therefore, participants in the economy that are actually ahead of the curve on the transition should, all else being equal, which of course it isn't, but all else equal, they should actually be companies that are more valuable. They have more growth opportunities. They have, a longer trajectory in time in which to sort of execute their business models. And of course, that it's much more complicated than that. But that is definitely a factor that I think now is a driver of corporate success. So I really think this dichotomy between financial returns and sustainable investment goals, is in the process of being thrown out, which I think is just a great thing, because I think it can enable everybody to just be much more constructive and actually start, making change, making the change that's needed on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, even in my short-time career within ESG, the conversation 6 years ago was how much alpha, like how much return do I need to sacrifice to be aligned, to align my values to my portfolio, to, especially last year, I think there was a big wake-up call to everyone, which was like, how much money is there actually to be made on top of my standard benchmark or my index that I reference by aligning my portfolio to my views. And I think this is a nice segue to like some of the like challenges that we've seen. Last year was a very strong year for like clean investments and a lot of like sustainability aligned portfolios. But I guess like the start of this year has been a little bit different. So maybe if we could talk about like some of the challenges that all of you see in your different spaces within sustainable investing, and how you think like that tide shifts when things start going from like very good earnings, very good momentum for some of these companies to maybe being re-rated.
I can start just on some general trends along what you're discussing there. And I think the beginning of this year, obviously we've had market volatility. And last year, as you quite rightly point out, was a big year of fund flows into ESG sort of strategies as well. So you have a natural kind of shift of flows of money going into some particular sectors. You know, as Sophia and Tilly have mentioned, you know, the energy transition is a big one. So some areas are going to naturally attract more money from ESG investors. But at the beginning of this year, and another big area is sort of technologies enabling that as well. But the premiums then sort of put on those types of companies have kind of skyrocketed over the past couple of years, and we saw a reversal of that. But fundamentally, the trends that those companies are trying to solve or are looking, or issues they're trying to tackle, are still there. So while we've seen, you know, some volatility, I think the sort of the fundamental trends and issues that some companies are trying to solve are still there and aren't going to go away.
I'm happy to add a few things because as Charlotte said, this reversal has been brutal. And in fact, I would argue that the reversal started actually 12 months ago. And we saw a number of those companies, you know, really suffering. And one of the reasons they suffered is if we look at the companies which are in the heart of, for instance, constructing, building renewable power generation. So turbine manufacturers, solar panel manufacturers, they have been at the heart of this massive dislocation in terms of supply chains issues and logistics issues. So those companies which are building those turbines, to give you some example, you know, they are massive. Some of the span of the wings on the turbines can be as high as the Eiffel Tower. So just to give you, you know, a sense of how big these turbines are. So imagine having to carry, you know, to transport those it's not blades, that's the word I'm looking for. You know, imagine, you know, carrying half an Eiffel Tower from one place to another. You need a huge ship to do that. And last year, the ships said, you know what? We don't want to carry your blade, you know, we need to carry, you know, thousands of mattresses because people can't buy mattresses. So, you know, your blade is just going to stay on that port. So, well, you know, the wind manufacturer, the wind turbine manufacturer, well, just couldn't put it together because the blade is somewhere in Asia and it's got to go to South America and it's not happening. So so companies have on what we call these sort of upstream renewables, the ones which are basically building the components for clean power generation. They are really struggling at the moment, and because their earnings are not good, well, the investors are selling them. So, and then what happens in such an environment? You start getting you know, market share wars, and then you depress prices. And if you basically look at it, you know, we've been at this since the late 1990s. I actually introduced the first listed wind generator in 2000. And at the time, you know, it was all driven by subsidies because nothing was profitable. And so all those companies actually have gone through boom and busts and back because of changes of subsidies, and so it's very difficult because, you know, if you have market share issues and then you lower the prices, and basically suddenly some of those companies which are essential, absolutely essential to this energy transition, go bust. Germany, for instance, had developed had decided to develop a whole solar panel industry in the early 2000s. And so you had investors who were backing them. And then the Chinese decided, hey, we can do it much better and at a cheaper price. And so the whole of solar panel industry in Germany was decimated. So if you had been an investor in there, you would have lost every single penny. So it's very, very difficult. It's a very immature cycle because it's a new industry, and new industries always go through startup cycle, basically, especially if you have the need of subsidies behind it. So it's really difficult. And at the moment, as Charlotte said, we've had a very, very brutal reversal.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. It caused some headaches for a lot of fund managers over the past couple of months. Maybe one question from the audience is, like, there's obviously a lot of metrics that exist and methodologies, and everyone's definition of ESG is different, and sustainability. But would anyone be willing to talk through some of, like, the approaches that you use to pick stocks within your portfolios, and how should you compare ESG risks across maybe industries or sectors or even countries, because there's obviously a lot of disparity between emerging market, the US, Europe?
I'm happy to have a go at that, although I'm not a stock picker, as I mentioned. And by the way, it would be great if people want to start putting questions in the chat. We're really happy to open it up to the floor and sort of talk about the things that are most interesting to all of you. But it is really interesting because there are a number of recognized ESG scoring or rating systems that exist in the market. And there was a really interesting piece of research that was recently done by some professors at the Judge Business School at Cambridge, who I know, which took a sample of stocks, well-known public companies, and they basically correlated the ratings from the 3 different leading ESG ratings agencies. And the outcome of that was that the correlation was essentially 0. So a company that was the top rated for sort of ESG by one of the agencies or one of the systems was sort of the bottom rated by one of the others, which just goes to show how nuanced and how difficult this type of scoring is. And of course, a lot of it is very qualitative. So, management team might be viewed by some as being very forward thinking in this area, or perhaps because they weren't focusing on a particular factor that was important to one of the other methodologies, they might be marked down. And that's why we have chosen to focus on emissions, because even though emissions measurement isn't perfect, at least it's something that's more concrete and less qualitative. So I think if individuals are thinking about investing in a sort of sustainable portfolio, I would really encourage you to actually do your own research. And as Sophia said, if you read the company's annual report, or you go on their website, you'll be able to see that, are they talking about these topics, but not so much just talking about it, but what have they actually done? What actions have they taken? What changes have they made to their business model? What actual concrete measurements do they put forward? There's a very old saying that any business school students here will have heard, which is what gets measured gets managed. So is the company actually reporting anything where they can show a trajectory of improved environmental credentials, for example? But I would say that I'm personally quite skeptical of a sort of blanket ESG score. I would be really interested to hear Charlotte's view on that, because you're probably the expert in that area on this panel.
No, I think to your point, Tilly, that the looking at the measuring of the targets that companies are setting themselves. So something when I'm doing research that I'll look at is literally the first thing I go to is that if they've got a sustainability report, what targets do they have? Are they measuring them? How often are they updating? Because sometimes, and it depends very much again on the type of company and how advanced they are, and also measuring the different aspects of targets they're trying to set. So on the environmental side, it's really difficult at the moment to try and measure all the different types of emissions, because again, it's been said earlier, there's various ways. There's no universal way of measuring it, and there's lots of different companies providing different ways of doing that. But that's the thing that I focus on, and then when I speak to a company, would ask them to expand on how they've come up with this roadmap, why certain areas are being focused on more, and have sort of sooner timelines of meeting these, and how they prioritize that. And often these companies, some of the reports are, I mean, some of the detail is amazing. And there really are some companies which are leading the way, not just in their sector, but they're then sharing methodologies that they're sort of creating as their own proprietary IP, really, but they see the bigger importance to share it with the rest of their sector, so that everyone else can advance in reducing X in their business, because that actually is beneficial to everyone. So I think the key thing is actually, as Tilly said, just looking at which companies are setting targets and how they're progressing, and I think the frequency of the update is important, because that shows, you know, how regularly that they're looking at these things.
Yeah, I mean, I would entirely echo what Tilly and Charlotte said. So we have looked at all these scoring metrics and different data providers, and as Tilly said, there's just zero correlation between all of them. Interestingly, it's people who, you know, who do these are in a very far country. They don't necessarily appreciate what the companies are doing. And often when they don't have the data, they actually estimate the data. So it's just not very reliable. So we don't use scorings. Those companies actually charge a lot of money to fund managers, and that is not money that we're prepared to spend. And the way we look at it is very much what Charlotte said, in terms of, you know, is there awareness? Are there some targets? Are they doing something about it? What's their track record? Very, very much like this. I will go one step further, because I used to visit a lot of companies, and especially in the mining industry. So I would go and fly in Australia in the middle of nowhere and go and visit mines. And people would always tell me, oh, but you know, one mine is like another mine, you can't see anything, but you can see so much, you can learn. And the best thing really to know if a company is really involved and serious about ESG and everything is around it, is to go and go to the mines, to the factory. You know, I'll give you some examples. To a factory, and then there's somebody who takes you as an investor and say, no, you know, look at these machines and so on. And then this lady is wearing high heels. Now that's bad. She'd be wearing safety shoes. You know, it's as simple as that. That means that somewhere in that company, somebody's not doing their job properly. Or if you're looking at the car park, you go to some companies where all the cars are turned, you know, so that they can come out in case of an emergency, and they can do it in a very orderly way. Someone in this company has thought about it. And you can't see this in a report. You have to go there and find out. Is the equipment well maintained? I mean, I can go on and on. That's the way to do it. And we manage actually a long-running ESG fund. And I want our analysts to go and, you know, on site and meet every single company we have. And I don't want to talk to management in London. I have zero interest. I want them to go in the middle of nowhere and find out, you know, how people are diverse there. You know, are you white men, for instance? You don't need to ask, you just see. So you have to go on site as a manager. That's what I want our team to do, is to go there and ask the questions, open the doors, speak to people. I'll give you if you don't mind, I'll give you a small example. Went to see one French company some time ago, and they actually are leaders, you know, scoring in ESG. And I went to the Louvre, and there was a panel body there. This was for the employees. If you see, the water leaking in the loo, you have to call that number and do something about it. And I like that. I'm thinking, wow, this company is taking this seriously. So these are the little things I'm looking at beyond CO2 emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I could see all of the panelists chuckle as Till was going through the correlation report, and definitely agree with that. The last thing that I'll mention quickly around like how to assess ESG risk, and obviously there's a lot out there, is that one tool that we used previously when I was looking at a lot of this is the materiality map from an initiative called SASB, because that proves like the point around like what you should focus on is very different based on what companies you're looking at. So if you're looking at a financials company, you might want to focus more on the governance and social factor, not to say that the environmental factors are less important, but maybe they're more tightly correlated to the performance of the risk of that company. So I think it's very important to focus on what really matters, because it's obviously impossible to look at everything. And I unfortunately will have to jump in 5 minutes, but I'll leave to wrap up, and I'm sure I'll leave you in good hands. But one question from the audience was around the role that private markets can actually play, and if private investors and private companies have more responsibility to drive this transition. And I think especially I really like this point that one of the people in our audience made around companies staying private for longer, having lower disclosure requirements from regulators and investors. So I don't know who wants to address that, but basically just thinking through the role that the private markets play in this.
I'm happy to have a quick, first thought on that, just because my whole background is in the private equity arena before taking on this role. And I think it's really interesting because private equity tends to... Sorry, someone else should go, my dog's going bananas. Sorry, somebody else go, because there's a fox wandering around outside my house. So I'll give him a couple of minutes.
Charlotte, do you have something to say on this?
I would just sort of echo, I guess, what Arianna said, just with regards to the transparency, sort of the focus on and call on public companies to be very transparent now is, again, I think has increased massively. It's very onerous now for companies, and depending on size of company as well, I think that's a big factor that plays in. Some smaller companies just don't, the resource is quite extensive to be as transparent as a lot of investors are asking companies to be, which is obviously very important, but I think that that is a big factor. I'm not an expert in private markets, but if I was to sort of I think that may deter some companies from moving to the private markets because of that sort of level of transparency. But then there's also companies in the private markets which would do very well from the investor interest in sustainable companies, and there's huge number of companies in that market and private markets. But I'll pass back to Jenny, who's
yes, I'll have another go. So please forgive me if that happens again, and if it does happen again, I may have to hand over to someone else to finalize the moderation. But I think I was saying that private equity companies get a bad reputation because the disclosure requirements are obviously much lower, or indeed there are very few sort of mandated requirements. But I do think, as I mentioned at the beginning, that buyout firms in particular have this most tremendous opportunity, because the buyout firms sort of control the governance of the companies that they buy. So if they decide to make sustainability a real priority, they can make change happen very, very quickly. So one of the private equity managers in our portfolio, for example, recently announced science-based targets across their entire portfolio that they're implementing, and they've really moved this up the agenda. They've made it a priority for the CEOs, somebody was telling me the other day that they'd actually started publishing league tables of their CEOs in terms of their progress on environmental sustainability, which was a great way to catalyze an intensive focus on that amongst all these CEOs who tend to be quite competitive individuals. So I think there's a really big opportunity for private equity. I think it's very, very early. So I think the firms that that are focusing on this area are sort of the leaders. But I think there's an increasingly intense focus from the limited partners, so from the investors, allocators like me and like many thousands of others. And I do think that it's moving up the agenda very rapidly. And I think that's a great thing. And I think the more, and this is one of the ways, if we go right back to the very beginning and we say, how can investors exert their influence? I can sort of demand answers and reporting from the private equity funds that we invest in, and if all the other investors do the same, then those funds will start to focus on these matters, whether it be environmental sustainability, whether it be diversity, and they will begin to report their progress, because then that's good business for them, as well as being great for society more broadly.
Yeah, and I think like the one point that I'll add before I let Tilly wrap up is that actually a lot of the newer companies that are now just getting started are focused entirely on that. Their entire business model, especially in the venture space, is completely focused on addressing environmental problems, like creating a marketplace for carbon credits. Actually, one of my former colleagues launched a company that does just that, or around measuring diversity, which is a very important topic. So I actually think that founders today, and all of you in the audience, whether you want to do it from the investment standpoint or the entrepreneur standpoint, have a role to play in that transition. Tilly, one question that came up that maybe I'll let you guys answer is around the difference between passive and active, and what considerations should go into that, and where there is a role maybe for both or one or the other. And I'll have to unfortunately say bye, but it was very great to meet all of you on Zoom, and I really look forward to seeing all of you hopefully in person at some point. And if there's any question, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Arianna. Arianna has to go to attend a class, I believe, so we were really lucky to have you for the first 50 minutes of this event. So yes, that question on passive versus active fund management is coming from the chairman of GAIN, Natasha Brzezinski-Munier. So many thanks, Natasha, for that question. I have to say, we at the Endowment, we don't really invest that much in passive fund management products. We're mainly involved with active managers who would sort of exercise their influence on a very bespoke basis. But of course, the big passive fund managers like BlackRock and others have enormous influence as some of the largest shareholders out there. So I would be really interested to hear if my fellow panelists have a view on that subject.
I think that with what, in fact, both of you, Tilly and Charlotte, said earlier, that the scoring is not necessarily reliable. If those big asset managers are using scoring, then you can question, I think, those methods. So I think in some ways you got the answers to that question before, in the sense that we think we need to do more qualitative assessments of companies. Now, of course, if you are a passive investor, you don't have the luxury to assess all those companies in a qualitative manner. Maybe I will actually use one of the other questions, which was, I think, just before Natasha, in terms of metrics. I can't actually quite see it here. Uniform methodology to be used soon. And I think that's a very good question. If you think about it, we have credit rating agencies, and they didn't just appear. Before, you would have people assessing credit of companies, and then eventually we got credit rating companies. Not that they did a particularly good job in 2008, mind you, but they exist and people use, use their standards. So I think, we could very well reach a point where there is some standardization. And as companies disclose more and more metrics, then it could happen. In fact, when we look at the disclosure rate, it's, I think in our report, if I remember, and I should remember, but I think it's more around the sort of 80% level. So it's not bad, but we're far from the 100%. And then of course it depends which metrics. I think on CO2 emissions, I think everybody reports it now. It's probably 95%, but on the other metrics, diversity, for instance, anything to do with diversity is very, very difficult because it also has a very political aspect. People look at diversity in a very different way in Europe than they do it in Asia or that they do it in the US. So, in some countries, you're not allowed to ask people, what race they are, what color they are, what, religion they are. You just can't. So I think on the diversity side, it's going to be very difficult to standardize things. I think it will be easier on the environmental side because that's, pretty objective. So I'm kind of trying to answer both questions at the same time because I think they're quite related.
Thank you, Sophia. Charlotte, did you have a view on the passive versus active?
I was bring in this sort of topic of the engagement and active engagement, and that's something that you picked up on, Tilly, earlier as well, is that kind of role where you as an investor are speaking to companies and asking them how they're approaching certain things, and this idea of divestment versus engagement and where that sort of plays out. And I think engagement's become a very big focus in the asset management community recently. I think often a lot of managers have always done it. It's been part of their process. But there's a lot more focus now on measuring engagement, which again is difficult because often these conversations with companies happen over years and you see progress, but there's a lot of engagement going on within the active management community at the moment, and sort of gauging how companies are approaching what they say they're approaching in their sustainability statements. So again, it kind of harks back to a lot about what we've talked about today, and as Sophia said, it's asking companies what they're doing and actually asking for examples as well is really interesting. So rather than just reading the reports, is asking for specific examples of actually where they might have found a problem. That's actually not necessarily a bad thing to have found a problem potentially in the way that they've been auditing things, if it's a supply chain or a workplace issue, asking how they are approaching that and how they would resolve that is part of what you do as active engagement. And so these types of conversations can actually be really helpful, I think.
No, I agree. And I think just as a final point on this active versus passive topic, I think we probably need to distinguish between the investment products themselves, where, by definition, a passive investment fund is just tracking an index. Now, of course, it could just be the index. It could be an index that's been negatively screened to remove fossil fuels or another category, or it could be an index that's been constructed with some kind of ESG scoring methodology, as a guide, and we've discussed that. So I think those are somewhat sort of blunt instruments, to put it in a way, but nevertheless can be useful for certain types of investors who may be smaller or may not have the appetite to sort of put together a more active approach. But nevertheless, these fund managers are huge holders of stock. So I think the products themselves are passive because they track an index, but the fund managers themselves can be very active still because they own very, very large blocks of certain companies, and so they can be very influential in terms of how they choose to vote their shares. And so I think it will be really interesting. I think it's still quite early days for the large passive fund management houses, to figure out how they want to exert their influence, but they certainly can be very influential just purely because of their scale. I think we only have a few minutes left, sadly, and I can see one more question that's come in. So thank you so much for that, which is on carbon credits. So what are people doing about it, and how much research goes into it? I think I might ask Sophia to comment on that one. I personally can claim absolutely no knowledge in this subject area. So over to you, Sophia.
Okay, well, we are big investors in carbon, so this is something that we follow by the minute. So, they are listed on the European system. And so just to give some background to some people, the price of carbon has risen from €5 a ton to close to $100 a ton in the last few years. And we're not quite at 100. I think the last price was 97. And so you have different ways. You have companies who are forced to buy some carbon credits. So for instance, European utilities need to offset all their CO2 emissions by buying some carbon credits. So they are actually the largest buyer of carbon credits. And then you have companies who are not quite do it, but have to do it. I'm thinking of, we're thinking cement companies, steel companies, for instance. I can see my internet connections unstable, so hopefully it's not cut. So there's a lot of demand for carbon credits, like us, I suppose, who do believe that you need a much higher carbon price to force, to incentivize companies using. It adds to their cost of running their operations, and so the high cost and some cleaner solutions. So yeah, so how much review goes into what people are actually doing? It's mandatory for a number of industries. It's going to involve. There are discussions of as well companies, for instance, which might produce some, let's say, some plastic outside of Europe, and who don't have to pay for those carbon credits, and they come and sell their products at a cheaper rate in Europe. So the European EU is basically looking at these border issues on carbon. So so there is a lot of what's the word? It's getting late here. There's a lot of examination of carbon. What I would say is that even the companies which don't have to account for carbon, they now are all looking at it, because we're going that way, and it's going to be mandatory. And it's if you do emit a lot of CO2, then at some stage it's going to hurt your profitability. So in one way, we were talking about returns before, and one thing we have seen is that the companies which are going with the energy transition have a tailwind, and the companies which are going against the energy transition have some serious headwinds.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost out of time, or indeed are out of time, but Charlotte, have you had any final comments on carbon credits? So I'd love to hear them.
I don't.
Okay.
Sophia, I think, covered it off expertly.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Sophia. Thank you to Charlotte. Thank you to Arianna, who sadly had to leave us. Thank you to Gain for putting this event together. And thanks to all of you for attending, for taking an hour of your Tuesday evening. We really appreciate it. There were some really great questions from the audience. We hope this has been helpful. And it would be great if you could just fill in the poll that's just popped up in a window. Just that really helps Gain to feedback to our sponsors about the kind of impact that these types of events can have. So if you could just click on that, just take a second to do that before you take off, that we would really appreciate it. And otherwise, we just wish you all a really wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Tilly and Charlotte. It was great. Really enjoyed it. And thanks for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Great questions, and hope you have a lovely evening.